Okay, girl, we need to have a conversation. Someone left a delicious one-star review calling this a lazy attempt to capture the nuances of growing up with two gay dads filled with trivial, frankly useless stories. They also claim this sounds more like an ad than a podcast. Well, anonymous internet critic with the literacy sophistication of a wet napkin, today's episode is dedicated entirely to you. Consider this your personal masterclass in exactly how non-trivial growing up gay adjacent actually is. Buckle up, Buttercup. Class is in session. When you're a kid, you don't really question your reality. You just assume everybody has two gay dads, a rotating cast of ex-boyfriends turned uncles, and spends their summers on a sandbar where people scream about cocktail ice like it's a human fucking right. I did anyway. Hi, I'm Ethan. I was raised in Manhattan, forged on Fire Island, and emotionally sculpted by watching grown men cry over mid-century patio furniture. This is my life, the way it actually happened. Messy, weird, and somehow kind of beautiful. This is Raised Right, Not Straight. Let me educate you on what constitutes a lazy attempt versus actually living through something, since you seem so confused about the difference between academic theory and lived experience. Growing up with gay parents in the 90s wasn't just having two dads instead of a mom and a dad. It was existing in a sociological experiment that most family therapists only read about in case studies. My dads didn't just magically appear with a baby. They fought through adoption processes that would make Navy SEAL training look like a spa weekend. Home studies, psychological evaluations, background checks, financial audits, character references from people they'd known for decades, and probably a fucking astrological compatibility reading. They had to prove their worthiness for parenthood in ways straight couples who accidentally procreate after 3 beers never have to consider. But sure, tell me more about how lazy it is to discuss the psychological impact of watching your parents fight for the basic right to love you legally. Here's your first dose of nuance, since you're so concerned with intellectual depth. Growing up with gay parents in Manhattan means learning to code switch before you know what code switching is. It means developing hypervigilance as a survival skill, not because home isn't safe, but because the world outside isn't always welcoming to families that look like yours. You learn to assess rooms instantly. Is this a space where my family is accepted or tolerated? Can I mention both my dads without watching someone's face do that uncomfortable micro-expression dance? Will the other parents at school pickup treat me differently once they figure out about my family structure? These aren't trivial social dynamics. These are building blocks of resilience, emotional intelligence, and what psychologists call minority stress adaptation. But I suppose discussing the psychological development of children in non-traditional family structures is too shallow for your sophisticated palate. Those 17 years of Fire Island weekends you dismiss as useless stories? That was a PhD program in queer community dynamics, social hierarchy navigation, and chosen family construction. Fire Island Pines in the 90s and 2000s was a living laboratory for marginalized community building. These weren't men just playing dress up on weekends. These were survivors of the AIDS crisis creating joy from trauma, and executives who spent Monday through Friday closeted in corporate America finally exhaling on Friday nights. I watched men in their 50s who'd been told their entire lives they were broken build something beautiful together. I learned about camp as a survival mechanism, about how marginalized communities create their own cultural languages, about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. But I also saw the shadow side, the substance abuse that comes from decades of suppressing identity, the body dysmorphia from growing up in a culture obsessed with youth and perfection, the way generational trauma gets passed down even in the most loving families. Apparently analyzing the sociological implications of queer space making is too trivial for your refined intellectual standards. Here's a paradox that might strain your clearly superior critical thinking skills. Growing up with gay parents doesn't make coming out easy, it makes it more complicated. I figured out I was gay around age 10, which in my environment was about as shocking as discovering water is wet. But here's the nuance you missed. Being gay adjacent isn't the same as being gay. Having gay parents doesn't automatically grant you membership in the community. You still have to earn your place, figure out your identity, and navigate the difference between being raised by queer people and being queer yourself. Even surrounded by every possible model of gay, coming out still felt like jumping off a cliff because representation doesn't eliminate internalized homophobia. And growing up in accepting spaces doesn't immunize you against societal messaging about what's normal. But sure, let's call that trivial because it doesn't fit neatly into your preconceived notions about queer experience. My career trajectory from airline executive to firefighter to aviation entrepreneur isn't just a resume, it's a case study in what happens when somebody raised to value authenticity finally starts living authentically. Working for United Airlines taught me about corporate structures, customer service, and the aviation industry. Becoming a volunteer firefighter was about channeling hypervigilance into something useful, using skills I'd learned as a kid to literally save lives. Starting my own aviation company was about creating spaces where people can exist without explanation or apology. These aren't useless career moves. They're the practical application of values learned growing up in a family that had to fight for the right to exist. As for your complaint that this sounds like an ad, what exactly do you think I'm selling? The glamorous lifestyle of volunteer firefighting, the lucrative world of aviation entrepreneurship, premier access to childhood trauma? If someone talking honestly about their life automatically sounds like marketing to you, that reveals more about your cynicism than my authenticity. Some people tell stories because stories matter, because representation matters, because someone sitting in their car after another day of feeling different might need to hear that different can be extraordinary. Here's the actual intellectual depth you somehow overlooked while busy being condescending. Growing up with gay parents teaches you that love is radical, that choosing to love someone when society discourages it is an act of rebellion, that families aren't just born, they're built, they're chosen, and they're defended every single day. It teaches you that normal is a myth designed to make people feel comfortable with conformity, that authenticity is more valuable than acceptance, that people society rejects often understand love, loyalty, and resilience better than anyone. But it also teaches you that being raised with unconditional love doesn't make you immune to pain, that having enlightened parents doesn't automatically make you enlightened, that privilege is complicated, trauma is universal, and healing is work that never ends. So to anyone else considering leaving reviews about how my stories lack depth or intellectual rigor, this isn't a sociology dissertation. It's not peer-reviewed research on LGBTQ+ family dynamics. It's one person's truth told with humor and honesty because that's how some of us survive. If you want academic analysis, go read a fucking journal. If you want sanitized inspiration, listen to fucking TED Talks. But if you want authentic stories about growing up different in a world still learning how to handle different, you're exactly where you need to be. Here's what's really beautiful about your review. You proved my point better than I ever could. You dismissed stories about queer family dynamics as trivial while simultaneously demonstrating exactly why these stories need to be told. You complained about lack of nuance while missing every fucking subtle point I've made. You're the reason this podcast exists. You're the audience that needs these stories most, even if you're too intellectually insecure to admit it. Growing up with gay parents in Manhattan wasn't just about having a different family structure. It was about learning that difference is strength, that authenticity requires courage, and that love comes in configurations most people never consider. It was about watching people create community from scratch, build families from choice rather than obligation, and find joy in spaces the world tried to deny them. Those trivial Fire Island stories, they're about resilience, community building, and what happens when marginalized people create their own culture. The useless details about ferry rides and beach house drama, they're the building blocks of identity, belonging, and chosen family. Every lazy observation about growing up gay adjacent is actually a masterclass in minority stress, identity formation, and the psychology of belonging to multiple communities simultaneously. That's all for today's very special Defending My Existence to Internet Strangers episode of Raised Right Not Straight. If you enjoyed hearing me absolutely demolish bad faith criticism while delivering a sociology lecture disguised as a clapback, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review, preferably one that demonstrates basic reading comprehension. Next week, we'll dive into something different. Next week, I have a surprise topic for everybody. And after this intellectual workout, I'm extra motivated to make it the most brilliantly trivial story you've ever heard. Until then, remember, your stories matter, your experience is valid, and sometimes the best response to intellectual gatekeeping is to get smarter and sharper. Thanks for listening. And to my anonymous critic, this entire episode was your free education. You're welcome.